The fog never lifted that morning. The air was still salted faintly with decay, and by dusk the house had begun to breathe again. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. I was first drawn to the Grayvale papers sometime in late autumn, while cataloguing the estate records at the provincial archives. It had been weeks since I'd found anything of substance among the brittle letters and parish ledgers, until one file, thin, sealed in rotting wax, fell apart in my hands. Inside were 7 pages written in a restrained, formal hand dated March 2, 1834, and signed by a Dr. Elias Corvin. The documents were brief but methodical, clinical even, and spoke of an anatomical irregularity observed within the rural parish of Lantern Hollow, a settlement no longer marked on any modern map. At first I suspected a misfiled medical case, something better suited for the university's pathology collection. Yet as I read, it became clear this was no mere account of illness. It was a record of intrusion, something between confession and warning. The handwriting was unsteady by the final page, the ink watered down as if diluted by shaking hands or tears. The Grayvale family, once prominent in that district, appeared repeatedly throughout the report. I had heard their name before in passing, minor gentry landholders with decaying property in the Midlands, but nothing beyond the ordinary misfortunes of old estates. Here, however, Dr. Corvin described them in unsettlingly anatomical language, a line prolonged unnaturally, the features folding inward through generations. He detailed a series of house calls between 1834 and 1836, visits prompted by episodes of trembling, lesions about the eyes, and the emergence of small cartilaginous nodules along the jaw. At first the condition seemed hereditary, but then the tone shifted. The child, Corvin wrote, does not sleep as others do. It murmurs distinctly though the mouth remains closed. I have observed movement beneath the skin of the throat, rhythmic, deliberate. It was this sentence that made me set the pages down, not because of its absurdity, but because of the precise professional calm with which it was written. I spent the following week tracing what little remained of Lantern Hollow. Parish maps from 1829 marked a cluster of dwellings beside the Ward River, about 40 miles north of Exeter. By 1850, the site was simply recorded as waste ground. No census, no parish registry, not even a burial record survived beyond. I applied for permission to visit the region, and though the archives had little interest, I received reluctant approval, so long as I filed a full report for the Regional History Society. The journey itself was uneventful until the final mile. The road narrowed into a lane hemmed by twisted ash trees, their roots exposed like veins. The remains of walls appeared intermittently through the mist-hewn stone, lichen-eaten, half-submerged in soil. When I arrived, there was nothing resembling a village, only the shell of what had once been a manor house. The upper floors had collapsed, but a section of the foundation still stood, a cellar entrance, its door bolted from the outside. I camped near the ruins that first night, keeping to the road until the air grew too cold. The silence was strange, absolute, yet not peaceful. Every few moments the ground seemed to sigh, a long exhalation through the moss. By the time dawn came, the fog had thickened to the point that I could barely see the outlines of my hands. What struck me most was the smell. Not the rot of vegetation, but something faintly medicinal, the odor of an old infirmary or dissecting room. It seemed impossible that any chemical trace could remain after nearly a century, yet it lingered there unmistakably sweet and acrid. Near the foundation I found remnants of papers that had been kept dry under stone ledger fragments, notes in multiple hands. One bore a familiar signature, Corvin, 1834. The script matched the Grayvale papers precisely. The fragment read only Subject 3 displays improved alignment of cervical segments, speech still erratic, will attempt rearticulation after bleeding subsides. I copied the line carefully into my notebook. Subject 3, it implied at least 2 others. I imagined Corvin standing there nearly 2 centuries earlier, writing in his medical calm as something inhuman attempted to form words before him. The cellar door, when I finally approached it, resisted at first, but yielded with enough pressure. Inside the air was colder than outside, and perfectly still. There were no furnishings left, only indentations in the stone floor where tables might have stood. Along one wall, iron fixtures remained embedded in the rock hooks, restraints, and what might have been the base of a drain. I took several photographs for the record, though the flash disturbed something in the shadows. Not movement exactly, but a tremor in the air as if heat shimmered across cold stone. The sensation left as quickly as it came, and when I examined the images later, one showed faint traces of light near the corner, 3 small reflections aligned vertically, like the vertebrae of a neck. Among the debris I uncovered a sealed jar, half filled with translucent liquid. The glass was thick, slightly green, Inside, suspended in the murk, was what appeared to be a section of tissue, faintly human, yet wrong in proportion. It had the suggestion of a face, but the eyes were misplaced, too close together, the mouth shallow and smooth. A thin cord of flesh extended downward, vanishing into sediment. I left the jar untouched. That night sleep was impossible. My tent shook twice without wind, and once I heard what might have been whispering beneath the ground, soft, rhythmic, like breath drawn through hollow wood. In the morning, the jar was gone. Only the circle of dust where it had stood remained, and a thin smear of moisture leading toward the collapsed doorway. I packed my things at once and departed before noon. Yet as I reached the ridge above the site, I turned back for one final glance. Through the mist I saw, unmistakably, the outline of someone standing within the ruin, motionless, tall, their head inclined as though listening. The shape faded as I blinked, leaving only the pale contour of the wall behind it. When I returned to the archives, I attempted to locate additional records on Corvin. None existed. His license, if he ever possessed one, had never been registered under the Royal College. I did, however, find a short obituary from the Exeter Courier, dated February 1830. Silas Corvin, aged 41, was found deceased in his home after a brief illness. Local accounts suggest an affliction of the throat. His practice will be discontinued. No surviving portrait, no burial record, nothing, just that terse paragraph. Since then, I've begun to notice something unsettling in my own recordings. When I play back the field audio from Lantern Hollow, there is a second voice beneath mine, breathing, deliberate, articulating words I cannot yet decipher. The files have been sealed for now, but I can feel that same air from the cellar still caught in my lungs, as if it learned the shape of breathing from me. And sometimes when the room is quiet, I hear the faintest murmur behind the walls. It's trying to speak again. The following day dawned with a stillness so absolute that even the insects seemed reluctant to stir. A thin fog clung to the grounds of the old estate, wrapping the garden paths in a kind of ghostly gauze. The oaks along the drive loomed pale and skeletal, their limbs slick with dew. From my window above the east corridor, I could just make out the outline of the carriage house, where I had been told Dr. Albrecht had once conducted his physiological trials before the war. The servants avoided that part of the property, and even the stable hands refused to linger after dark. The house itself seemed to breathe differently since my arrival. Every sound, the settling timbers, the sigh of the wind between shutters, felt almost animate, as if the structure were listening. During breakfast, Miss Harlow remarked that the portrait in the dining hall had been found tilted forward on its nail, face down on the wainscot. The cord snapped clean through. The humidity, she said with forced levity, does dreadful things to hemp. But no one laughed. The portrait in question had been of her great-uncle, Dr. Severin Harlow, the founder of the Society of Medical Inquiry, whose emblem, a serpent coiled around a chalice, was still carved into the keystone above the main door. That afternoon, I walked the grounds with Elias, the caretaker. His manner was quiet, deferential, and yet his eyes held the guarded look of a man accustomed to keeping difficult secrets. He carried a lantern though it was midday, claiming the mist in the orchard could swallow the path if you lost your bearing. When we passed the low brick wall behind the smokehouse, I noticed an area where the soil seemed newly turned. Storm damage, he muttered before I could ask, his fingers tightening around the lantern handle. But the earth was too deliberate, too symmetrical. 4 narrow mounds, side by side, marked only by flat river stones. Inside the house the air was thick with camphor and the faint metallic odor of ether. Miss Harlow kept to her chambers most days, her illness confining her to a wheeled chair which Elias maneuvered through the corridors like a silent sentinel. I caught only glimpses of her, her thin hands resting on a blanket, her throat wrapped in white gauze. Once in passing, she reached out to touch my wrist. Her skin was cold as marble. "You have steady hands," she murmured, steadying my palm with unsettling interest. "That's rare in a man so young. I do hope they've not brought you here merely to catalogue books." That night, unable to sleep, I took a candle and descended to the lower hall. The house was different by lamplight. Corridors narrowed, ceilings seemed to bow. I followed the faint draft that crept up from beneath the servants' stairs, until I found myself before a door I had not noticed before. It was smaller than the others, half hidden behind a tapestry. The latch was cold under my hand. It opened to reveal a flight of stone steps spiraling downward into utter dark. The smell met me first, earth, iron, and something faintly sweet, like fruit gone to rot. I should have turned back. Instead I descended. The candle flame guttered, sending shadows writhing across the walls. At the bottom lay a narrow passage lined with old laboratory benches, their surfaces littered with rusted instruments, broken glass and fragments of parchment gone brown with age. A single object stood out among the decay, A metal chair bolted to the floor, its armrests fitted with leather restraints. Beneath it, a shallow drain cut through the stone, leading to a small cistern in the corner. Around the base of the chair were dark stains that no number of decades could have wholly erased. On the wall above hung an anatomical chart, the edges curled and brittle. It depicted the human circulatory system, but the heart was rendered not in red but in black ink, as if the artist had known something the textbooks did not. I heard movement then, a soft shuffle, like fabric brushing stone. The candle flickered violently, throwing my own shadow up the wall. I called out, voice breaking the stillness. "Is someone there?" Silence answered, but a faint rhythmic tapping began somewhere behind the cistern. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. I fled. Back in my room, I sat shivering until dawn, the half-melted candle clutched in my fist. I told myself it must have been Elias, checking the foundations, though even as I thought it, I knew it was a lie. The tapping had been deliberate, measured, almost patient. The following morning, Mrs. Harlowe's condition worsened. Her pulse, Albrecht informed me, had become irregular, but promising, a phrase that struck me as both absurd and sinister. I assisted in recording her temperature and respiration, though I noticed the doctor's focus was not upon her illness, but upon the color of her blood as it welled from a small incision at her wrist. "See how it darkens," he whispered. "That is the exhaustion of the human. She must be replenished." Replenished. Later in the physician's study, I found a ledger marked only with the initials S. On men's side were notes in Albrecht's precise, angular script entries, spanning decades, detailing experiments in transfusion, cellular exchange, and vital reciprocity. Names were listed in the margins beside measurements of pulse and temperature, followed by the word terminated. Some of the names I recognized, former servants, laborers who had moved north. The last entry bore the date March 12, 1834, and beside it, the name Eli. That night the tapping returned. This time it came not from the basement, but from the wall behind my bed. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, followed by a pause, then 3 again. I pressed my ear to the plaster and thought I heard something breathing on the other side. By morning, I resolved to leave the estate. Yet when I went to the stables, Elias stood waiting beside the empty carriage. "The horses took ill," he said quietly. "It happens when the fog lingers. The air here isn't right." He met my eyes then, and for the briefest moment, I saw something like apology there, before he turned and walked back toward the orchard. That evening, Dr. Albrecht summoned me to the drawing room. The curtains were drawn tight, the lamps turned low. Miss Harlowe reclined on the chaise, pale but alert, while beside her stood a narrow table, laid with surgical instruments gleaming like silver fish in water. "You've seen the state of her decline," the doctor said, his tone almost priest. "What we attempt now may seem unorthodox, but it is sanctioned by the society and by reason itself." He gestured to a decanter on the table, filled with a liquid the color of old honey, a tincture derived from the black root. "It awakens what the blood alone can." When I hesitated, he smiled faintly. "You have steady hands, Mr. Keene. You will assist me." The procedure began at dusk. Mrs. Harlowe's eyes rolled upward as the liquid was poured between her lips. Within moments, her breathing slowed, then quickened, her skin flushing, as though she burned from within. The doctor murmured measurements, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hand. Then, without warning, she gasped. A deep, ragged sound, and clutched my wrist with unnatural strength. Her eyes opened, pupils wide and black, reflecting no light at all. "I can hear them," she whispered. Under the floor, the doctor seized her shoulders, shouting for restraint. I stumbled backward, overturning the decanter. The scent of the tonic filled the room, iron, mercury, and something sweetly decayed. Her body convulsed once, twice, then fell still. "Note the time," Albrecht said quietly. I could not speak. Her fingers still clung to my sleeve, rigid as stone. Then from somewhere deep in the house, I heard it again. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. The doctor's expression did not change. "Do not be alarmed," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "It is merely the pipes settling." But I knew the sound too well. It was the same patient rhythm from the cistern below, from the wall behind my bed, as though something beneath the house was signaling to us, marking each event, each death, with measured certainty. That night I did not sleep. I sat by the window, watching the mist move over the orchard, thick and white as breath. Somewhere, in that fog, I could see the faint outline of Elias's lantern bobbing between the trees. He was digging, again, and in the stillness between each swing of his spade, I swore I heard it. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. When dawn came, it brought with it a thin rain that hissed softly against the window panes. The fields beyond the orchard glistened as though varnished with mercury. I had not slept, my candle burned down to the socket, leaving black soot smeared across the desk, like the residue of some extinguished thought. Below, I could hear the servants moving about their tasks, though their voices seemed muted as if the house itself were absorbing their speech. Albrecht did not summon me that morning, yet I found myself drawn again to the lower hall, compelled by a need I could neither justify nor suppress. The hidden stair awaited, its stones slick with condensation. Each step echoed faintly, carrying the sound upward, until it felt as though the entire house were listening to my descent. The basement air was colder than before, and the lamps I had left upright now lay toppled. I followed the narrow corridor to the metal chair. The stains around its base had deepened, slick from the damp, their color resembling something fresher than rust. On the wall opposite hung a series of new charts, drawings I was certain had not been there the night before. They depicted human silhouettes, each surrounded by concentric rings of light. Beneath them, Albrecht's handwriting noted phrases, like vital transmission, reciprocal channel, and post-dilution phase. Then I saw the cage. It was small, iron bars set into a frame bolted to the wall. A shape lay within, huddled beneath a coarse blanket. At first I thought it a bundle of rags, until it moved. The sound it made was not quite human, more like a sigh caught in a throat too long unused to speech. My hand went cold around the lantern handle. "Who's there?" The figure shifted. A thin arm emerged, skin waxen and mottled, veins blue as ink beneath translucent flesh. The blanket fell away enough for me to see a face, or what remained of one, eyes sunk deep in their sockets, mouth drawn taut around teeth that looked too sharp for any human mouth. Yet when it spoke, the voice was unmistakably human. "Help," it whispered. "Please." I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lantern. "Who are you?" The creature tried to rise but faltered, its limbs trembling. "Elias," it said faintly. The name struck through me like a nail. Elias, the caretaker, the man I had seen digging in the orchard only hours before. I looked closer. The shape was thinner, ravaged, but there was something of him there, the line of the jaw, the scar across the temple. His eyes, when they found mine, were lucid with pain. "They took it," he gasped. "Took what makes me live. They said it was for her. Said it would make her whole again. Mrs. Harlow?" He nodded weakly, then coughed. A sound wet and low, as though his lungs were full of water. "Not the first time," he whispered. "Not the first of us. They do it to all who stay." Before I could move closer, a sound came from above, the creak of a door, footsteps descending. I doused the lantern and slipped into the alcove behind the cistern, just as Dr. Albrecht entered the room. He moved with purpose, humming faintly, his coat buttoned high despite the heat. Two men followed him, their faces unfamiliar, likely from the town. They carried something between them wrapped in canvas. "Set it there," Albrecht ordered, pointing to the table beside the chair. They obeyed without question. The bundle was laid out, and when the cloth fell away, I saw the pale face of Mrs. Harlow. Her eyes were closed, her expression strangely serene. Albrecht regarded her with the calm reverence of a man examining a successful specimen. "Vitality transfer complete," he murmured. "Pulse ceased 3 hours post-application. Integration remains partial." He turned to the men. "Dispose of the body at the usual place, and clean the table thoroughly this time. We cannot have any trace remaining." The men nodded. One produced a flask from his pocket, and took a long swallow before bending to his work. Albrecht lingered, making notes in a small ledger. "The next subject must be stronger," he muttered. "Younger. The strain of the donor is paramount." I waited until they had gone before emerging from the shadows. The cage was empty now. Elias was gone. Only the faint metallic smell remained. On the wall, Albrecht's latest entry read, "Experiment 47. Result, partial vitality transfer. Donor viability sustained. Recipient expired. Society will be informed." I fled the basement once more, emerging into the corridor above, as the rain gave way to a strange stillness. The air smelled of copper and ozone. From somewhere distant came a dull thudding, steady, mechanical, like a pump drawing fluid through unseen veins. In the afternoon I gathered my few belongings, and attempted again to leave, but when I reached the gates, I found them chained and locked. The iron links, slick with dew, the keyhole was filled with wax. There would be no leaving until Albrecht allowed it. That evening, he appeared at my door. "You've been wandering," he said without preamble. "That is unwise." I tried to muster composure. I heard noises in the cellar. I thought perhaps one of the servants. He raised a hand. "You are curious. That much is clear. It is a useful trait in moderation, dangerous in excess. He stepped into the room, his eyes moving over the open trunk, the coat folded neatly atop it. Planning to leave so soon? The society will be disappointed. I don't understand. Oh, I think you do. He smiled faintly. You have a mind for observation. That is why I requested you. You will record the next stage. He left then, closing the door softly behind him. I heard the click of a lock turn from the outside. The next 2 days blurred together. Meals were brought to my room by a silent girl I had never seen before. At night I heard Albrecht's footsteps pacing below, the rhythmic hiss of bellows, the clang of metal against glass. On the third night, the knocking returned. 3 slow beats from within the wall, followed by the faint whisper of something moving through the pipe. I awoke before dawn to find a note slid under my door. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, under the floor, beneath the chapel. They're all there, no signature. When the household slept, I slipped into the corridor and made my way to the old chapel at the north end of the property. The door was swollen with damp, but I forced it open. The air inside was cold and sharp with the scent of mildew. Candles lay melted into puddles along the altar rail. The crucifix above the pulpit had fallen, leaving 2 rusted nails where Christ's hands once were. Behind the altar I found a section of floor that sounded hollow when tapped. I pried it up with a loose board and revealed a narrow passage descending into darkness. The walls were lined with shelves, rows upon rows of glass jars, each containing something suspended in clear liquid. Some held organs, others entire hands or eyes, floating serenely like pale flowers. A label on each jar read only a date and a set of initials. The earliest was from 8. The most recent, written in Albrecht's meticulous hand, bore that same day's date. At the far end of the chamber stood a wooden crate. Inside were ledgers, scores of them, each bound in black leather. I opened one at random. Within, diagrams traced the outlines of bodies connected by tubes and valves. Beneath, a note in Latin: translatio vii est, translatio peccat. The transfer of life is the transfer of sin. I heard footsteps behind me and froze. Remarkable, is it not? Albrecht's voice was almost tender. 2 centuries of study, hidden beneath consecrated ground. You see now what the society truly is, a fraternity of preservation. We are not monsters, Mr. Keene. We are custodians of the human spark. He stepped closer, holding a small vial of amber liquid. Do you wish to see proof? Before I could answer, he uncorked it and poured the contents into a basin beside the nearest jar. The liquid hissed faintly. The preserved heart within began to beat, slowly at first, then with terrible regularity. Life, he whispered, even here, even in death. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. You're insane. Am I? He said softly, or merely ahead of my time? Imagine a world where decay is optional, where the worthy need never wither. The heart in the jar thudded louder, its rhythm matching the slow, deliberate knocking that now echoed through the chamber walls. 3 beats. A pause. 3 more. Albrecht's smile wide. They answer when called, he said. Even now the others stir. I turned and ran, his laughter following me up through the passage like smoke. When I reached my room, I bolted the door and collapsed against the wall. My hands would not stop shaking. In the silence that followed, I could still hear it, somewhere deep below the heart's rhythm, merging with the knocks, as if the entire house had found its pulse again. By the second night after my discovery beneath the chapel, a violent wind had risen from the marshlands, rattling the shutters until their hinges screamed. The orchard trees thrashed like figures in agony. Rain pounded against the roof in long slanting sheets, drowning the faint sound of the bell that marked each hour from the village beyond the valley. Thornfield House seemed to shudder beneath its own history, as though the foundations had grown restless. Sleep eluded me. Every flicker of lightning brought the illusion of movement in the corners of the room, a shoulder turning, a face withdrawing into the dark. The candle at my bedside had burned low, its wick drowning in its own wax, when I heard it again. 3 knocks, slow, hollow, patient, but this time they came not from the walls, they came from the inside of the wardrobe. I rose, compelled more by terror than courage, and pressed my ear to the wood. For a moment there was only silence, then something scraped faintly, the sound of fingers, not claws. I forced the door open. Inside hung my damp coat, the journal, the lantern, and nothing more. Yet beneath the coats the floorboard bulged, as though something pressed upward from underneath. It yielded when I pushed. The plank lifted easily, revealing a narrow shaft leading into the dark between the walls. A faint draft carried the unmistakable smell of antiseptic and iron. My hand trembled as I lowered the lantern. The light caught a handprint on the inner brick, smeared, small. I might have turned back then, but the thought of Elias, of the hollow eyes that had begged for help, drove me onward. I lowered myself into the gap, feeling the damp stone press close on either side. The descent twisted sharply, then opened into a low corridor that slanted toward the center of the house. It was narrow enough that my shoulders brushed the walls as I walked. After some distance, the tunnel widened. A faint glow flickered ahead, greenish and unsteady. I doused my lantern and crept forward. The passage ended in a grated archway, overlooking a hidden room. Dr. Albrecht stood within, his back to me, coat removed, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The room was filled with the hum of machinery, bellows, pumps, and a series of glass cylinders filled with liquid that pulsed in time with that awful heartbeat I had heard before. A figure lay upon the table at the center, restrained by leather. Begin transfusion, Albrecht said calmly. A second man stepped from the shadows, one of the servants, gaunt and expressionless. He adjusted a valve. Fluid began to flow through the clear tubes connecting the cylinders to the body on the table. The figure convulsed. The skin of the subject was pale, stretched thin over sharp bones. As the fluid entered, its color changed, pink returning to gray flesh, veins blooming faintly blue. The eyes fluttered open. My God, I whispered. Albrecht turned suddenly, and though the grate concealed me, his gaze seemed to pierce through the darkness to where I crouched. You see, he said softly, as if addressing me directly, it endures. It always endures. He leaned close to the body. Do you know? The revived form struggled to speak. Its voice came like a sigh torn from somewhere far beneath the world. Albrecht, please, stop. His expression softened almost tenderly. You misunderstand. It is not punishment. It is continuation. The man on the table convulsed again, and the fluid in the tubes turned dark, swirling with sediment. Albrecht watched, expression unreadable, then reached to cut the flow. The body went still. He stepped away, making notes in his ledger. Subject, deterioration with unexpected parameters. He murmured, memory retention remains a complication. Cognitive stability, unreliable. Then he said something that turned my blood cold. Next trial, familial transfer. The blood must remain within the line. The spirit endures only where the roots are pure. I understood then what the society had been cultivating in secret. Not merely the preservation of life, but its confinement, its refinement through blood. A lineage curated like an experiment, a family tree reduced to an instrument. I withdrew, my every breath shallow, until I was certain he could no longer hear me. The passage twisted upward again, leading to a small hatch that opened into the library. I emerged behind a shelf of anatomical texts. The storm still raged outside, and the air reeked of wet paper and old dust. On the desk lay Albrecht's open ledger. The last entries were written in a hurried scrawl. Beneath that, in smaller letters, subject secured. Awaiting dusk. A list followed. Initials, dates of birth, and one name underlined twice. E. Keene. I read it 3 times before my mind accepted what it meant. Me. There was no longer any doubt that I was. I seized the ledger, intending to burn it, but a voice stopped me. You shouldn't have come up here. It was the servant, the silent one, who had assisted in the transfusion. His eyes were pale as glass. He said you'd see it eventually, said you were the right vessel. He stepped closer. I saw then that his wrists bore circular scars, as though bands had once bound him tightly. We all belonged to him one way or another, he said. Better to accept it than to fight. I struck him with the lantern before he could reach me. He fell back, dazed, and I ran through the corridor, past the portrait hall where the faces seemed to watch in silent judgment, down the main stair where the wallpaper had begun to peel like shedding skin. I reached the front doors, but again the chains held firm. I could see the lightning flash through the glass, illuminating the overgrown path beyond the gate. So close it seemed I might touch it if only the locks would yield. Behind me, footsteps approached, calm, deliberate, echoing with that same steady rhythm as the pump. You disappoint me, Albrecht said. His voice was not angry, only weary. I had hoped you would understand. You have her blood. You could have carried her within you. Whose blood? I demand. He smiled, and in that moment, the resemblance was unmistakable. The sharpness of the cheekbones, the same pale eyes. You know her name, he said. You've known it all along. My mind returned to the portrait in the upstairs hall, the woman with my mother's face. I stumbled backward. That's impossible.
Nothing is impossible, Albrecht murmured. Your mother was my sister. You were born of the same strain that has preserved us for generations. It is through you that we continue. The circle must close. I backed toward the stair. You're mad. He raised a small vial, the same amber liquid he had used before. No, merely patient. He stepped forward. Come, Elias, he said softly. It will be quick. Lightning tore across the windows. For an instant the entire hall was filled with white fire. The vial slipped from his hand, shattering against the floor. The fluid hissed, spreading like spilled light across the marble. Albrecht stared down at it in disbelief. The next flash revealed his face contorted, his eyes burning with something that was not anger but grief. You've doomed us, he said quietly. Without the bond, the blood fails. The house will not forgive. Then came a sound from beneath, a low groan, as though the foundations themselves were shifting. The lamps along the corridor flickered, then went out. From below, the rhythmic knocking began again, slow, methodical, enormous. Albrecht turned toward the sound. They wake, he whispered. The floor trembled. Cracks snaked through the marble, spreading outward like veins. The storm outside seemed to answer with a roar. Albrecht fell to his knees, whispering prayers I did not recognize. I turned and fled up the staircase as the first of the portraits fell from the wall. Behind me, something heavy gave way. A beam, or perhaps the ceiling itself, and I heard Albrecht's final cry swallowed by the sound of splintering wood. I locked myself in the nearest room, and pressed my back against the door. The air was thick with dust, the house shaking like a living thing. In the flicker of my lantern's dying flame, I saw movement in the mirror. Across the room, shapes gathering, faces emerging in the glass. The eyes were hollow, but I knew them. Every subject, every donor, every experiment. They stared silently, lips moving in unison. Though no sound came, the flame died, the mirror darkened, and then, from within the glass,
The dawn that followed the escape brought a fragile, deceptive calm. The woods were drenched in mist, silvering the leaves and muffling every sound. Silas's limbs ached as though every fiber of his body remembered the cruelty of the previous night, the metallic taste of blood still lingering faintly on his tongue. Abel leaned heavily on Marcus, his breathing shallow, each exhale a reminder of how narrowly life had clung to him. Samuel, the man they had freed from the cage, remained silent, his eyes wide and haunted, staring ahead as if the night's horrors had become an indelible lens through which he now viewed the world. The wagon lurched forward along the river road, the creak of its wooden wheels mingling with the occasional distant bird call. Josiah drove in near silence, his eyes scanning every shadow, every irregularity along the path. The men and women they had evaded for so long, Thornhill and his loyal enforcers, would be behind them, but Silas took solace in the meticulous planning that had guided this escape. Every mile north felt like a mile away from hell, yet each one came with the weight of the knowledge they were carrying. The journals and copies hidden in Silas's shirt were more than just paper. They were testimonies, evidence, the very seeds of a reckoning that might reach far beyond Dallas County. Through the first day the wagon moved cautiously. They stopped only to switch horses or exchange drivers, and each pause was measured and tense. The dampness of the morning had turned into oppressive heat by midday, the air thick with the scent of river mud and pine resin. Silas pressed himself against the side of the wagon, feeling the rhythm of the road beneath, trying not to think about the lives lost in Thornhill Manor's basement. 7 unmarked graves, subjects of grotesque experiments, reminders that human cruelty could take shape in the most calculated and clinical ways. He forced his gaze to Samuel, noting how his hands, skeletal and trembling, flexed involuntarily, fingers curling as though he still remembered the cage. By the second night Abel had regained some strength, able to sit upright for brief stretches without succumbing to exhaustion. Silas had taken to whispering fragments of his notes to him, as much to keep Abel conscious as to affirm the reality of their shared survival. Samuel remained unresponsive to conversation, but Silas could tell that the man's mind was absorbing every detail of their journey. Each mile through the woods, each shadowed glade, was an extension of their struggle for life and testimony, a continuum of the horror they had left behind but could not forget. They reached the first safe house as dawn broke on the third day. A discreet cabin, hidden among thick undergrowth, offered refuge. Silas, Marcus, and Celia carefully lifted Abel and Samuel inside, laying them on straw-strewn floors, while Josiah retreated silently into the woods to await their next signal. The host, a quiet woman named Miriam, moved among them with practiced ease, producing warm broth, clean water, and a patchwork of bandages. Silas drank greedily, feeling nourishment flood a body he had thought would collapse entirely under its own trauma. He took a moment to study Samuel, whose face was pale, eyes sunken, yet unmistakably alive. There was a defiance there, fragile but unmistakable, a refusal to be erased by the cruelty he had endured. As the day wore on, the cabin became a small sanctuary. Silas took out the papers hidden beneath the loose floorboard, spreading them across the rough wooden table. He began meticulously reviewing the copied passages, cross-referencing them with his memory of the experiment. The inked sketches of veins, arteries, and surgical instruments seemed to leap off the page, a testament to the clinical obsession that had driven Rutled and Thornhill. He copied further annotations, detailing which procedures were most revealing of the society's methodology, ensuring that every shred of evidence that could survive public scrutiny was secured. In the quiet hours, Celia and Marcus conferred in whisper. They had already planned the next leg of their journey, the safe houses that would take them steadily north. Canada was their ultimate goal, the land where they could hope for freedom without the constant shadow of bounty hunters or plantation enforcers. But even in these moments of planning, the weight of their responsibility was inescapable. They were not only fleeing for themselves, they were carrying with them witnesses, survivors, and proof of atrocities that demanded exposure. Evening brought exhaustion, yet sleep was uneasy. Silas's dreams were punctuated by fragments of last night's horror, the convulsions of vigilia, the hiss of valves, the metallic smell of blood, Abel's cries, Samuel's hollow-eyed stare. Every image was stitched together in impossible clarity, and he woke repeatedly, heart pounding, sweat cooling against the damp of the cabin. Celia pressed a hand to his forehead, murmuring that rest was necessary, and for long stretches he allowed himself to close his eyes. But in the back of his mind, he repeated the names of the lost 7 subjects, whose stories had been buried under the weight of secrecy. He swore silently that they would not be forgotten. On the 4th day, they resumed their journey. Travel was painstakingly slow. Abel's legs were still weak, requiring Marcus and Silas to alternate support. Samuel's body, long confined to a cage, was even more delicate, his spine curved and his muscles wasted. Yet for the first time, his eyes held a spark that indicated recognition, not just of his surroundings, but of the fact that he was no longer property, no longer an object for experiment. Silas felt a fragile hope stirring. If they could survive this journey, if the evidence reached the north, perhaps justice, or at least acknowledgement, was possible. They avoided roads when possible, moving through dense forest corridors and along streams that would hide their scent. Every movement was measured. Every sound, distant barking, a snapping branch was a potential threat. Yet the determination that had carried them out of Thornhill Manor continued to fuel their step. Each mile north was both a physical and moral imperative. The further they moved from the site of unspeakable cruelty, the closer they came to freedom, witness, and testimony. On the 5th night, the cabin they reached was larger, a farmhouse with a loft, occupied by a family sympathetic to the cause. Silas spread out the journal copies once more, preparing a comprehensive account of the experiment. He annotated margins, cross-referenced dates, and added observational notes about the behavior of the society members, the hierarchy within Thornhill Manor, and the methods used to control and manipulate both slaves and witnesses. Marcus and Celia assisted, making shorthand notes, marking passages that could corroborate testimonies. Abel, though weak, contributed where he could, confirming sequences of events he had observed. Samuel remained quiet, but Silas included him fully in the planning, ensuring that his survival was not merely passive, but an active, vital testimony of what had occurred. The 6th day brought their first interaction with other escaped slaves traveling north, through the Underground Railroad network. They shared brief, coded exchanges about routes, safe houses, and patrols, reinforcing the intricate system that had protected freedom seekers for years. Silas listened intently, absorbing information that would allow them to continue without detection. He felt the weight of history in those exchanges, a network born of necessity, courage, and quiet defiance, against an institution that treated some lives as expendable. By the 7th day, Abel had regained enough strength to walk short distances, without assistance, though Silas and Marcus still accompanied him closely. Samuel, though fragile, exhibited slight increases in responsiveness, an occasional nod, the faintest murmur, a hand lifting in recognition. These incremental recoveries brought a measured relief, but also renewed vigilance. They were still in the south, still at risk, and any misstep could result in recapture or death. Silas pressed the journal copies into a waterproof leather pouch,
securing them against rain and accident. These papers were not only evidence, they were the bridge between the horrors of Thornhill Manor and the possibility of accountability in the wider world. Night after night, the four of them moved cautiously, stopping in small clusters of safe houses, always aided by the network's careful coordination. Silas documented their journey, recording routes, safe locations, and incidents of near discovery. Each note was written with trembling hands, the memory of the basement laboratory's cold lamps and metallic smell still vivid in his mind. He reviewed each passage of the journal again, ensuring that every critical detail had been preserved, ready to withstand the scrutiny of the public and the disbelief of skeptics. Finally, after nearly 3 weeks of careful travel, they crossed into Northern Territory, where the presence of slave catchers was diminished and the network of abolitionists stronger. The moment was neither triumphant nor celebratory. There was no fanfare, no grand announcement, but in the quiet of a small farmhouse just over the border, Silas allowed himself to feel a faint stir of hope. They were alive, carrying both survivors and the weight of evidence that could not be ignored. The journey had exacted its toll, physical, mental, and spiritual, but they had preserved something beyond life true. In the days that followed, Silas worked with abolitionist contacts to verify and prepare his testimony. Samuel, though still weak, confirmed critical details, while Abel recounted observations from the dual donor procedure. Celia and Marcus coordinated logistical support, ensuring safe transit for the documents and witnesses. Letters, sworn statements, and cross-verified journal entries were compiled meticulously, creating a dossier that was both thorough and damning. Silas understood that public reception might be mixed, that skeptics would accuse him of fabrication, yet he trusted that the specificity of medical detail, the corroboration of witnesses, and the presence of living evidence would make total dismissal impossible. When the pamphlet finally appeared in Philadelphia, Silas held a copy in trembling hands. Medical Atrocities in the Southern States contained not just testimony, but proof, names, dates, procedures, sketches, and the living scars of Samuel stood as undeniable witness. Though the Southern press denounced it as abolitionist propaganda, and though many tried to ignore or discredit the claims, the damage was done. The American Anti-Slavery Society now possessed what could no longer be denied: evidence of systematic human experimentation, cruelty beyond the bounds of law, and the moral bankruptcy of men who had once been respected members of society. The pamphlet's release stirred immediate, polarized reactions. In northern cities, abolitionist societies clamored to disseminate the evidence. Public readings were held in lecture halls and churches, often accompanied by exhibitions of the diagrams and testimonies copied from the journal. Silas, though physically drained from the journey and nights of painstaking documentation, attended several of these gatherings. He read aloud passages from Thornhill's journals, detailed sketches of surgical procedures, and the witness statements of Abel and Samuel. The audience listened in horrified silence at first, many visibly trembling as the calculated cruelty of the experiments was revealed. Then, outrage and resolve grew, voices rising together demanding action against the perpetrator. In Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, the newspapers splashed front-page coverage of medical atrocities in the southern states, juxtaposing sensational headlines with excerpts of clinical descriptions from Thornhill's journals. Monsters in the guise of medicine, one paper declared. Southern experimentation beyond law or morality, read another. Skeptics in the press attempted to discredit Silas's account, calling it abolitionist propaganda or fabricated horror story. Yet the sheer specificity of the evidence, the names, dates, measurements, surgical sketches, and the living witness Samuel, rendered complete dismissal impossible. Even those sympathetic to the Southern cause could not deny that something grotesque had occurred at Thornhill Manor. Across the South, reactions were muted, though quietly. The shock rippled through elite circles. The Society of Medical Inquiry, once cloaked in respectability, dissolved under public scrutiny and internal panic. Thornhill himself had fled, rumored to be hiding in the deep swamps of Louisiana or abroad in Europe. Rutled disappeared without trace, whispered to have escaped to South America. Judge Levinson withdrew from political life, his ambitions torn. Several wealthy planters quietly liquidated assets connected to the experiments, while others attempted to distance themselves from the scandal, claiming ignorance, or claiming they had severed ties with Thornhill. Yet the shadow of the truth lingered, like smoke impossible to fully dissipate. Silas, Abel and Samuel, now far north in Canada, began to rebuild fractured lives. Abel, whose body had endured months of exploitation and near-fatal procedures, slowly regained strength. He learned to walk without assistance, and the trauma in his eyes gradually softened, replaced by cautious optimism. Samuel, too, began to regain control over his own body and voice, though the scars, both physical and psychological, remained. Each day, Silas documented their experiences, cataloging both the horrors they had endured and the resilience they exhibited. He wrote not merely to record, but to testify, ensuring that every detail would survive attempts at erasure. In Canada, abolitionist societies recognized the importance of their testimony. Samuel was given opportunities to speak publicly, recounting his experiences under restraint, the inhumane experiments, and the systematic cruelty of the Society of Medical Inquiry. His words carried a weight that no written account could replicate. The tremor in his voice, the hesitation, the visible scars. Audiences responded with empathy and outrage. Many moved to action, contributing to networks that supported escaped slaves and campaigned for the abolition of slavery in the United States. Abel, too, shared his recollections, particularly the dual donor procedure that had nearly claimed his life, emphasizing the disregard for human life among the perpetrators. For Silas, the act of documenting and sharing the story became a form of survival itself. He wrote long into the night, cross-referencing the journal entries with his own memories, refining testimonies for accuracy and impact. Each recounting reinforced the truth that he carried, that 7 lives had been lost, that cruelty could masquerade as progress, and that witnesses, when brave enough, could shine a light even into the darkest corners. He became a fixture in abolitionist circles, consulted for accuracy, and relied upon to educate both the public and lawmakers about the hidden horrors that unchecked power could produce.
The caged man Samuel lived only 3 more years, his body never fully recovering from the months of abuse and starvation he had endured. Yet those years were filled with meaning. He became an active participant in Canadian abolitionist efforts, using his testimony to illustrate the stakes of moral vigilance and the urgency of systemic change. His existence was proof, a living repudiation of the society's claims that their experiments were scientific progress. Though fragile and permanently scarred, he found agency in telling his story, transforming suffering into a catalyst for justice. Abel, meanwhile, slowly acclimated to freedom, finding purpose in advocacy and support for other escaped slaves. He became a bridge between communities, offering guidance, protection, and insight into the networks that had enabled their escape. Silas continued to chronicle their stories, publishing pamphlets, letters, and essays detailing Thornhill Manor's atrocities. The documents were referenced for decades, cited in abolitionist literature and eventually in historical studies, examining medical ethics, slavery, and human rights violations in the antebellum South. The impact of the evidence extended beyond the immediate lives of Silas, Abel, and Samuel. The American Anti-Slavery Society leveraged the pamphlet and testimonies to galvanize Northern support, influencing public opinion and lending moral weight to political arguments against slavery. The journals and written accounts became instruments of change, demonstrating that documentation, when combined with courage, could challenge even the most entrenched systems of oppression. While the Southern press attempted to dismiss the findings, the growing abolitionist movement ensured that the truth could not be buried completely. Years later, Silas reflected on the journey. He recalled the faces of the 7 individuals whose lives had been taken, the agony of Abel and Samuel, and the terror of witnessing the dual donor procedure. He understood that their survival and the survival of their testimony was a triumph not just over Thornhill and his society, but over the broader machinery of dehumanization. Writing became both remembrance and resistance, a way to honor those who had died and to hold accountable those who had inflicted unspeakable suffering. In 1923, decades after the events, the surgical instruments discovered beneath the ruins of Thornhill Manor were donated to a medical museum. They remained a silent testament to the cruelty once perpetrated within those walls, a reminder of the capacity for human evil when morality is subordinated to ambition and ideology. The journals Silas had copied were never recovered, presumed destroyed, but the story endured, preserved in print, memory, and oral histories, passed down through generations of abolitionist and human rights advocates. Ultimately, the story of Thornhill Manor, of Silas, Abel, and Samuel serves as a stark lesson. The greatest horrors are not supernatural but human, born of greed, ambition, and a failure to recognize the inherent value of all lives. Their courage in witnessing, documenting, and surviving demonstrates that even in the darkest circumstances, truth and justice can endure. And it reminds us that remembrance is itself a moral act, ensuring that suffering is acknowledged, that atrocities are exposed, and that those who inflicted harm are not permitted to vanish into obscurity. The legacy of their actions continued for decades. Activists, historians and writers drew upon Silas's detailed testimonies to illustrate the human cost of slavery and unethical experimentation. Students of medical ethics examined the journals and procedures as cautionary tales, reflecting on the line between scientific inquiry and sadism. Families of abolitionists recounted the story of Silas and his companions, celebrating the bravery it took to survive, to document and to testify. Though Samuel's life was tragically short, his survival provided a living, undeniable testament that could not be silenced. Silas never stopped writing. Each account, each lecture, each pamphlet was infused with the memory of the 7 who had died at Thornhill Manor and the countless others whose suffering remained invisible. He understood that history required witnesses, that testimony could challenge power, and that the act of remembering was itself a rebellion against injustice. The story of Thornhill Manor became more than a narrative of horror. It became a narrative of resistance, survival and moral reckoning, carried forward by those who refused to let evil pass unchallenged. Even in Canada, among the freedom and relative safety, Silas and his companions lived with the echo of the manor. Nightmares returned intermittently, dreams haunted by the sound of blood dripping, of distressed screams, of metallic smells, but alongside the horror was resilience. They had escaped, they had survived, and they had ensured that the story, the truth, would endure. In the act of surviving and documenting, they reclaimed not just their lives, but the lives of those who had been denied voice, agency and recognition. Their journey was a testament to human courage, the power of evidence, and the enduring fight for justice in the face of unimaginable evil. And so the horrors of Thornhill Manor, once hidden behind wealth, power and cruelty, became known. The names of the 7 lost lives were preserved. Abel, Samuel and Silas became witnesses whose courage illuminated a dark chapter in history. Their actions reminded the world that even when oppression is absolute, even when cruelty is sanctioned by society, the voice of truth can endure, and the human spirit can persevere. Years passed, yet the shadow of Thornhill Manor lingered in the memories of those who had escaped. Silas continued his tireless work as a chronicler and lecturer. His notes, testimonies and pamphlets became reference points, not only for abolitionists but for scholars studying ethics, medicine and the psychology of cruelty. He corresponded with prominent thinkers, sharing details of the Society of Medical Inquiry's methods, the dual donor transfusions and the devastating human cost. Even decades later, he was invited to speak to medical students, emphasizing that scientific curiosity, unmoored from morality, could yield atrocities beyond imagination. Abel built a quieter life in Canada. He found solace in community, working to help other escaped slaves find safety and stability. His strength, once shattered by the experiments, gradually returned, and he became a symbol of resilience for those around him. He often recounted his experiences to small groups, carefully emphasizing the importance of vigilance, courage, and mutual aid. Samuel, though frail, contributed to the growing network of anti-slavery advocates. His voice, scarred and trembling, carried weight precisely because of the horrors he had endured. Every word he spoke reminded listeners that atrocities do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They persist until witnesses bear them into the light. Silas never ceased writing. Even after the initial pamphlet, he continued to document accounts from other survivors of Southern experimentation and abuse. He sought to preserve the names and stories of the forgotten, the anonymous victims whose suffering might otherwise have vanished. His manuscripts became a growing archive of cruelty and courage, referenced by abolitionist leaders and later historians who studied the intersections of science, ethics, and human rights. Each entry he made was a declaration. No suffering would be forgotten, no life discounted, no truth erased. Despite the attention the pamphlet drew, justice for Thornhill and his collaborators remained incomplete. Thornhill himself disappeared from public record, a fugitive protected by anonymity and geography. Rutled's fate was a matter of rumor, with whispers placing him in remote parts of South America, continuing obscure medical work or vanishing entirely. Judge Levinson and other members of the society quietly retreated from public life, some resigning from political office, others changing professions or leaving the South altogether. Yet the moral accountability they evaded served as a reminder that law and power are not always aligned with justice. For the broader world, however, the story of Thornhill Manor became a touchstone. It influenced legislation, medical ethics debates, and public awareness of the human cost of slavery. The detailed records Silas preserved were used by reformers to highlight the necessity of oversight,
accountability and compassion in scientific endeavors. Universities and medical schools referenced the events when discussing the limits of experimentation and the responsibilities of practitioners. Even decades later, students studying history or ethics were shown Silas's testimony, Abel and Samuel's accounts, and the reconstructed journal entries to illustrate the dangers of unchecked authority and dehumanization. In Canada, a memorial was eventually erected in honor of the 7 lives lost at Thornhill Manor. Though small, it bore the names of the deceased inscribed in stone for permanent. Silas attended the dedication, Abel standing beside him, Samuel in a wheelchair, his eyes bright with recognition of what had been achieved. The memorial became a place of remembrance, reflection, and education. Visitors were encouraged not only to mourn the victims, but to consider the ethical responsibilities we all bear when confronted with injustice. Silas often reflected on the choices they had made during the escape. Each decision, risking their own lives, returning for the caged man, documenting the journals, had carried the weight of potential death, yet each act had also created ripples, small at first, then widening, carrying truth to those who might act, teach, and remember. In his later years, he wrote that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That lesson, learned in the darkness of Thornhill Manor, became the central theme of his life's work. Abel, now fully integrated into his community, occasionally revisited the river road where their escape had begun. He recalled the stench of the basement, the terror of the procedures, and the oppressive heat of the southern summer. Yet he also remembered Marcus, Celia, and Josiah, the allies who had risked everything to ensure their survival. He recognized that freedom was not only about escaping chains, but about forging networks of support, solidarity, and resistance. Samuel, fragile yet dignified, became a living testament to resilience. Though his body was broken, his spirit remained indomitable. He corresponded with abolitionist societies across North America, offering testimony, advice, and moral support to those still at risk. Every time he recounted the horrors of the dual donor procedure, the clinical cruelty of the experiments, and the inhumanity of the Society of Medical Inquiry, he transformed his pain into a tool for social change. His voice, once silenced, became a weapon against injustice. Meanwhile, the instruments and remnants recovered from Thornhill Manor remained preserved in the medical museum. Visitors often paused before the displays, sensing the weight of history, imagining the lives that had been subjected to those instruments. For scholars and lay people alike, the collection was a chilling reminder that scientific progress, when divorced from morality, can become a vehicle for atrocity. The museum's curators emphasized the ethical lessons, ensuring that the horror would serve as education, reflection, and a warning for generations to come. Silas's writings were eventually compiled into a larger volume, including his first-hand accounts, Abel and Samuel's testimonies, and transcriptions of the most damning passages from Thornhill's journals. The book circulated widely in abolitionist circles, and later became a reference for historians studying antebellum medicine, slavery, and ethics. Despite the destruction of the original journals, Silas's meticulous records preserved the truth for posterity. He often wrote that the act of documentation was itself a moral imperative, an obligation to speak for those who could no longer speak. In the quiet moments, Silas reflected on the 7 lost lives, the suffering endured, and the choices that had saved the living. He understood that horror was not abstract. It was a tangible, lived experience, inflicted by human hands and sanctioned by human institutions. Yet he also understood the power of courage, testimony, and solidarity. Freedom, he realized, was not only escape from physical chains, but the reclamation of dignity, voice, and moral agency. As the decades passed, the story of Thornhill Manor continued to resonate. Lectures, pamphlets, and museum exhibits kept the memory alive. Abel, Samuel, and Silas's courage became emblematic of resistance in the face of cruelty. Though the horrors of the past could not be undone, they could be remembered, and their lessons applied to future generations. The narrative reminded all who heard it that even in the darkest corners of human cruelty, bravery, documentation, and solidarity could illuminate a path toward justice. And so the legacy of Thornhill Manor endured, not in secrecy, not in denial, but in the unyielding testimony of those who survived, those who bore witness, and those who refused to let suffering be forgotten. The horror remained, but so did the hope. In the end, the story was not only one of atrocity, but of resilience, resistance, and the enduring power of truth. Even as Silas, Abel, and Samuel settled into their new lives, the past never truly left them. Nightmares visited Silas in the small hours, visions of the laboratory, the glowing lamps, and the faces of those who had died under Thornhill's hands. Yet each dream reinforced his He understood that memory itself was a weapon, one that could cut through denial, complacency, and forgetfulness. He wrote tirelessly, often revisiting his earliest notes, refining the testimony, and ensuring every detail, every name, every procedure, was recorded. Silence, he knew, was complicity. Abel, though physically stronger, carried his trauma differently. He sometimes recoiled at sudden movements or the sound of dripping water, reminders of the basement lab and the transfusion tables. Yet he worked within the community, teaching reading and basic skills to other escapees. In doing so, he transformed his suffering into service. Each act of help, each story shared, became a ripple in a network of resistance that stretched across towns and borders. He knew that saving a single life, or preserving a single memory, was worth the continued struggle against despair. Samuel's condition remained fragile, his body permanently scarred by the experiments, yet his mind remained sharp, his will unbroken. He became an advocate for humane treatment, lecturing to abolitionist societies, sharing the lessons of the dual donor transfusions, and describing the intricate cruelty of the Society of Medical Inquiry. His testimony emphasized not only the horrors of slavery, but the dangers of science without conscience. Audiences listened, horrified, moved, and inspired. Samuel's existence alone became proof that even the most damaged lives could bear witness, could influence, could change the world. Across the United States and Canada, the pamphlet Medical Atrocities in the southern states continued to circulate. Northern newspapers debated it, some calling it sensationalist, others confirming fragments of the testimony through independent investigation. Even decades later, scholars cited Silas's meticulous accounts to demonstrate how unchecked power and pseudo-scientific rationalizations could facilitate cruelty on a massive scale. Thornhill's influence faded, but the documentation of his crimes endured. Each copied journal entry, each affidavit, each testimony became a fragment of evidence that resisted erasure. Though the South largely ignored or denied the scandal, small communities began to talk quietly about the ethics of medical experimentation and the treatment of enslaved people. Local historians noted that even in areas where slavery remained legal, stories of Thornhill Manor circulated like whispers, warnings of what could happen when morality was sacrificed for scientific advancement. Silas's work therefore became not only historical record, but a moral compass for future generations. Silas continued to correspond with abolitionist societies, sharing updates and he advised reformers on documenting atrocities, emphasizing that even the smallest detail, a date, a name, a procedural note, could later become crucial evidence. He believed in building a mosaic of truth, piece by piece, so that no atrocity could be dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. Each letter, each pamphlet, was a tool of justice, a small weapon against the persistent machinery of oppression.
Abel, in quieter moments, reflected on Marcus Celia and Josiah, the allies who had risked everything for their escape. He knew that without their bravery, the journey through the Underground Railroad would have ended in death. He honored their courage by living fully, by advocating for freedom, and by teaching others that solidarity was more powerful than fear. Every life saved became a testament to what ordinary people could accomplish when they refused to ignore evil. Samuel's final years were spent meticulously dictating his recollections to Silas, ensuring that even the smallest details of his captivity, the dual donor experiments and the conditions in the basement laboratory were preserved. Though his body weakened, his mind remained a beacon of memory and resistance. He emphasized that history could not be rewritten or sanitized. The truth must be preserved, even when it is painful, ugly, and inconvenient. The instruments recovered from Thornhill Manor, displayed in the medical museum, continued to draw attention. Visitors often paused in silence, absorbing the gravity of human suffering captured in cold metal and glass. Curators explained the context, emphasizing that ethical responsibility must always guide scientific inquiry. The instruments were no longer tools of cruelty, but symbols of caution, moral vigilance, and the consequences of unchecked power. Decades later, historians pieced together Silas's work, Abel's testimony, and Samuel's recollections. They found corroborating records in local archives, in northern newspapers, and even in fragmented letters from former Society of Medical Inquiry members. The story of Thornhill Manor became a cornerstone case in discussions of medical ethics, human rights, and the moral responsibilities of science. It was taught in classrooms, referenced in legal debates, and remembered in memorial. Each mention was a testament to the courage of those who refused to let horror remain hidden. Silas, in his old age, often revisited the graves in the North Field, the site where 7 lives had been lost. He planted small flowers and read aloud the names of the deceased, ensuring that their memory would endure. He wrote in journals, adding context, reflections, and moral commentary, always reminding himself and future readers that human cruelty is amplified when society turns a blind eye. Yet he also wrote of hope, of survival, and of the possibility of moral action, even in the darkest circumstances. Abel eventually married and raised a family, teaching his children the stories of resilience, courage, and the importance of standing against injustice. Samuel's health eventually declined, and he passed quietly, but not unnoticed. His funeral was attended by abolitionists, scholars, and members of the community who had known him as a living testament to survival and testimony. They spoke of courage, remembrance, and the power of witness, ensuring that his story, like Silas's and Abel's, would be carried forward. Silas, the last of the trio, lived long enough to see a changing world. Slavery was abolished, new laws protecting human subjects were enacted, and medical ethics became a formal discipline. Yet he knew the lessons of Thornhill Manor were never merely historical. They were eternal reminders that power without conscience can corrupt, and that truth, documentation, and courage are the only defenses against cruelty. He continued to write, lecture, and advise until his final days, always emphasizing that even one voice, one witness, can shape history. In the end, Thornhill Manor became more than a place of horror. It became a symbol of the depths humans can sink when morality is abandoned, but also a symbol of the heights that courage, solidarity, and witness can reach. Silas, Abel, and Samuel ensured that the story would not be forgotten, that the 7 lost lives would be remembered, and that future generations would learn from the darkness, rather than repeat it. And so, the story of Thornhill Manor closed, not with silence, but with the persistent echo of truth, courage, and the unyielding refusal to let suffering be erased. The legacy endured, whispered through memorials, written testimony, and the quiet hearts of those who remember. Even as Silas, Abel, and Samuel settled into their lives in Canada, whispers of Thornhill Manor's dark legacy continued to echo through the South. Though the Society of Medical Inquiry had dissolved, some of its former members quietly resurfaced in distant towns, their reputations partially restored but never fully untainted. Silas knew that the horrors they had witnessed might never be fully reckoned with, but he also understood that silence would only empower future atrocities. The stories they carried, written and oral, became shields against complacency, small lights in a world too often shadowed by cruelty. Abel, whose body had healed but whose mind remained scarred, often lingered on the question of justice. What did it mean to survive when others had perished? He sometimes imagined Thornhill's return, imagined facing the man who had caused so much suffering, but he refused to indulge fantasies of revenge. He channeled his anger into teaching and advocacy, telling his story to communities, to children, and to anyone who would listen. Each recounted tale was a spark, a call to vigilance, a reminder that ethical responsibility cannot be assumed, it must be actively pursued. Samuel's health, fragile as ever, limited his physical activities, but his mind remained sharp and unyielding. He spent hours each day corresponding with abolitionist societies, medical reformers, and historians. His letters emphasized the importance of evidence, journals, testimonies, medical instruments, even the living scars borne by survivors. Every piece of documentation was a weapon against denial, against the erasure of history. Samuel understood that memory alone was fragile. It needed corroboration, it needed visibility, and he ensured that the records of Thornhill Manor, of the 7 graves, of the systematic experiments, would be impossible to ignore. Even decades later, traces of the past persisted. Occasionally, Silas received letters from descendants of the society's former members, expressing guilt, seeking absolution, or offering fragmented confessions. Some claimed ignorance of the full extent of the experiments. Others admitted complicity, citing societal pressure or fear. Silas read each letter with the same mixture of sorrow and resolve that had guided him since the first day he witnessed the horrors in the basement laboratory. He answered carefully, never with malice, but always insisting on accountability. History could not be rewritten, only acknowledged. The surviving instruments from Thornhill Manor continued to captivate and horrify visitors at the medical museum. Scholars and students would linger, often in silence, absorbing the cold logic and clinical cruelty embodied in the tool. Exhibits highlighted the necessity of ethical oversight, demonstrating how science unmoored from morality could descend into monstrosity. Silas occasionally visited, walking among the glass cases, imagining the hands that once wielded them,
imagining the faces that had suffered. It was a ritual of remembrance, a personal vow that the memory of the 7 lost lives and the suffering of countless others would never fade. Abel, Silas, and Samuel occasionally revisited Thornhill Manor in their letters and recollections, piecing together the fragments of what had occurred there. Local oral histories in Dallas County hinted at strange events, unexplained disappearances, and rumors of buried secrets. Though much had been destroyed or concealed, the trio's documentation created a chain of evidence strong enough to prevent the complete erasure of history. Each year, the pamphlets and letters circulated further, reaching new readers, inspiring new advocates, and ensuring that the story of Thornhill Manor remained alive. As Silas grew older, he reflected on the choices that had brought them this far. The decision to risk their lives during the dual donor transfusion, the secret passage through the tunnel system, the perilous journey through the woods and checkpoints. Each moment of fear and uncertainty had led to survival, testimony, and ultimately, moral victory. But he also acknowledged the cost, the 7 lives lost, the permanent damage to Abel and Samuel, the shadow of trauma that would never fully lift. Survival did not erase the past, it only offered the chance to confront it, document it, and use it as a weapon against injustice. Even in Canada, danger lingered. News arrived occasionally of slave catchers and bounty hunters seeking fugitives, of allies in peril, of laws that still failed to protect freedom and life. Silas and Abel understood that their journey north was only the beginning of a lifelong struggle against oppression, deception, and cruelty. Freedom, they realized, was never guaranteed. It had to be defended continually, often at great personal cost. The trio maintained careful communication with abolitionist networks, aiding other escapees and chronicling new accounts of mistreatment in the South. Each story they received, each escape they facilitated, was another thread in a larger tapestry of resistance. The horrors of Thornhill Manor became a lens through which they could view the broader struggle, a reminder that evil often hides behind respectability, that human suffering can be systematized under the guise of science, and that courage and witness are among the most potent weapons against injustice. In quiet moments, Silas would return to the journal entries he had copied beneath his floorboard, reading the clinical records of pain and death. He memorized the names, numbers, and procedures, not out of morbid curiosity but as a promise that these lives mattered, that these atrocities would not be forgotten. Each page reinforced his conviction that testimony, precise, detailed, unflinching, was a moral act, a bulwark against denial. Abel and Samuel, too, embraced memory as responsibility. Abel taught the young, passing down the principles of compassion, vigilance, and moral courage. Samuel shared his story wherever he could, transforming his suffering into a warning and a call to action. The trio, though separated in age, health, and circumstance, remained united in purpose, to ensure that the horrors they had endured would not vanish, that history would bear witness, and that future generations would be equipped to confront evil when it arises. Even as the world slowly changed around them, the shadow of Thornhill Manor lingered, a reminder that human cruelty can thrive under the cover of propriety and science, and that courage, documentation, and solidarity are the only remedy. Silas, Abel, and Samuel had survived, but more importantly, they had remembered, testified, and acted. The moral weight of their choices would ripple outward, touching lives they would never know, inspiring actions that might prevent similar atrocities in the future. The legacy of Thornhill Manor was, in the end, a paradox, a place of unimaginable horror that gave rise to extraordinary courage, a site of death that inspired life, a story of despair that became a story of moral vigilance. Silas, Abel, and Samuel ensured that it would never be erased, never forgotten, and never repeated without scrutiny. Their survival, testimony, and relentless documentation became a lasting shield against the human capacity for cruelty, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of history, light, however fragile, can endure. And so, the tale of Thornhill Manor closes not with peace or resolution, but with vigilance, a story carried forward in memory, testimony, and moral duty, challenging all who hear it to confront injustice, to bear witness, and to act when the shadow of cruelty appears. Years passed, and the names Silas, Abel, and Samuel carried became whispered legends in abolitionist circles. Their courage and perseverance became case studies, cited in pamphlets, speeches, and essays advocating for freedom and human rights. Even as time dimmed the immediate horror of Thornhill Manor, the memory of the 7 lives lost and the experiments endured never faded in their minds. Each anniversary of their escape was a reminder of the stakes of survival, of the price of witness, and of the fragile, precious nature of freedom. Silas continued to write, Meticulously documenting everything he had seen and experienced, he expanded on his original testimony, including more context about the Society of Medical Inquiry, their methods, and the complicity of bystanders. Each record he created was cross-checked with Abel and Samuel's recollections, forming an increasingly detailed archive. These accounts were sent to abolitionist networks, shared at secret meetings, and passed along to sympathetic journalists. The story of Thornhill Manor became a moral touchstone, a demonstration that evidence and testimony could pierce even the most impenetrable walls of denial. Abel, still haunted by his trauma, found purpose in activism. He traveled cautiously through communities, speaking to escaped slaves and free black families, teaching them strategies for survival, self-preservation, and documentation. He emphasized that memory was a weapon, and that storytelling could be as vital as any physical escape. His lectures were interwoven with warnings about human cruelty, the necessity of vigilance, and the power of collective resistance. Abel's own recovery, both physical and emotional, served as proof that survival could coexist with testimony and action. Samuel, whose fragile body, never fully healed, became the quiet historian. He spent his days corresponding with abolitionist societies in the United States and Canada, offering detailed recollections and ensuring that the narrative of Thornhill Manor remained accurate. His accounts stressed the systematic nature of the atrocities, linking the seemingly isolated horrors of the manor to a broader pattern of oppression and exploitation. Samuel understood that without evidence, memory alone might not suffice. His letters, affidavits, and recollections preserved the truth for generations who would never witness the horrors firsthand but could learn from them. The story of the caged man, Samuel, remained a central testament to the atrocities of Thornhill Manor. Though he regained speech slowly, his body bore permanent scars from years of captivity and experimentation, yet every time he spoke, he became living proof of the cruelty inflicted at the manor, and the possibility of survival against impossible odds. His presence at abolitionist gatherings and private meetings lent gravity to the written records, ensuring that no denial could erase the tangible reality of what had occurred. Even the northern newspapers, which had initially questioned the validity of Silas's testimony, began to recognize the veracity of his account over time. Investigators who had visited Dallas County found traces of the horrors described, and while local Southern officials quietly buried the scandal, the evidence could not be entirely erased. The graves, the remnants of instruments, and the corroborating accounts ensured that Thornhill Manor would forever occupy a dark corner of historical memory, a cautionary tale of science divorced from morality and humanity. Silas often reflected on the moral choices that had defined their survival. He thought about the decisions made in the heat of terror, risking their lives to save others, returning to the manor to retrieve journals, and even carrying the skeletal caged man through the wood. Each choice had consequences, but together they had formed a narrative that could not be silenced. Silas recognized that true courage was measured not only in survival, but in the willingness to bear witness, to endure trauma, and to transform personal suffering into public accountability. Abel and Samuel's presence offered constant reminders that courage is not solitary. Survival was not an individual achievement but a collective effort, sustained by collaboration, trust, and moral commitment. Each act of bravery, each story recorded, each person freed contributed to a broader struggle against injustice. In their lives, the trio embodied the principle that even when the law fails, when society turns a blind eye, human compassion, documentation, and resistance could create change. The legacy of Thornhill Manor also extended to those who had once turned a blind eye, descendants of society members, some seeking to understand their family's past, encountered the detailed records preserved by Silas, Abel, and Samuel. They faced difficult questions about complicity, morality, and the ways privilege can shield cruelty. While some responded with denial, others confronted the truth, contributing to a slow but meaningful reckoning. The story did not end with escape. It reverberated, demanding acknowledgement and reflection, long after the actors themselves had passed. In the quiet moments of his life, Silas often returned to the floorboard where he had hidden the copied journal entries. Though the original journals had been lost, their contents survived in fragments, scraps of paper, memorized passages, and his own meticulous records. He treated these remnants as sacred artifacts, a tangible connection to the people who had suffered and a moral duty he had assumed. Each reading reinforced his commitment to justice and remembrance, a quiet affirmation that memory, carefully preserved, could challenge even the most entrenched systems of cruelty. Abel, Samuel, and Silas also nurtured hope for future generations. They recognized that the horrors of Thornhill Manor were extreme, but the human tendencies they revealed, greed, dehumanization, moral blindness, were universal. Their advocacies stressed vigilance, empathy, and accountability as necessary tools for building a just society. By sharing their stories widely, they sought to ensure that future societies might be better prepared to recognize and resist similar abuses, wherever they occurred. Though the immediate terror of Thornhill Manor faded with time, its moral lessons endured. The trio's survival and testimony became a symbol of resilience, a demonstration that even in the face of organized cruelty, ordinary people could assert the value of life, the power of memory, and the importance of ethical action. Silas, Abel and Samuel, scarred, resilient and unyielding, proved that witness could transform trauma into advocacy, horror into moral education, and silence into a chorus of accountability. And so the story of Thornhill Manor, while rooted in horror and tragedy, ultimately became a testament to human courage, moral duty and the enduring power of truth. The three survivors ensured that the lives lost were remembered, the atrocities were documented, and the story itself became a weapon against complacency, injustice and cruelty. Through their actions, they demonstrated that even in the darkest chapters of history, light, fragile but persistent, can endure, bearing witness for all who come after.